Let me welcome you to the Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy at Brown University. I am Richard Arenberg, visiting professor of the practice of political science here at Brown, and I'm honored to serve this year as interim director of the Taubman Center, which is a part of the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. Welcome to the many Brown students, faculty, alumni, and other interested citizens joining us virtually tonight. The Taubman Center seeks to influence American politics and policy through scholarship, public opinion polling, conferences, workshops, academic research, internships, and a robust series of speakers drawn from experts, the media, academia, think tanks, and public officials. The Taubman Center for several years has focused its efforts on three themes: the pursuit of security, the cost of living, and the challenges to our democracy in America. This year, we're placing special emphasis on the national elections and the subsequent consequences as the nation grapples with issues of social justice, public health, education, the economy, and commitment to the rule of law, with a roster of outstanding speakers and programs. Tonight, we present the third in our series of events with a conversation with one of America's leading investigative reporters, Michael Isikoff of Yahoo News. Michael Isikoff is Chief Investigative Correspondent for Yahoo News and co-author of the New York Times bestseller, Russian Roulette, the inside story of Putin's war on America and the election of Donald Trump. In addition to his role as Chief Investigative Correspondent at Yahoo News, he's also editor-at-large for reporting and investigations. He digs into national security and money in politics. Previously, he was an investigative correspondent for NBC, as well as a staff writer for Newsweek and the Washington Post. In addition to Russian Roulette, which I've already mentioned, he's the author of Uncovering Clinton, A Reporter's Story, which he wrote in 1999, and co-author of Hubris, the inside story of spin, scandal, and the selling of the Iraq War, which he wrote with David Korn in 2006. He hosts a Yahoo News podcast with Daniel Klaidman. I'm a dedicated listener of that. He hosts a second series of podcasts called Conspiracy Land, in which he delves deeply into notorious conspiracies and examines the traction they get on social media. The most recent three-part series investigates the 2001 death of a former staffer to then Congressman Joe Scarborough. He'll talk more about that. In an earlier series, he investigated the Seth Rich case. Michael graduated from Washington University and holds a master's degree from the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University. My conversation with Michael will last approximately until 7 o'clock and will be followed by question and answers with the audience for about 30 minutes. You may enter questions through the Q&A box, which will be viewable to me. You may begin entering questions if you have them already, beginning now and throughout the event. Please keep them short and to the point. I will convey as many of these questions to Michael as we have time for. The event is being recorded for later viewing, available on the Taubman Center website and the Watson Institute website. I know we're all anxious to hear from him, so let me introduce our guest, Michael Isikoff.
Thank you, Rich. It's an honor to be here. And I should mention that on Skullduggery just this week, we interviewed Rhode Island's Senator Sheldon Whitehouse about the upcoming Supreme Court battle.
He'll be here in this series just in a week or two.
Oh, really? Yeah.
On the same subject.
I'm sure he definitely has lots to say on that, and also that my co-author for both Hubris and Russian Roulette, David Korn, is a Brown graduate. So that's another connection to your audience.
Well, let me leap right into the fringe world of conspiracy. A whole array of conspiracy theories under the label QAnon seem to be rapidly emerging from the obscure dark fringe areas of the internet and taking hold more broadly in our politics. One avowed supporter, Marjorie Taylor Greene, appears poised to win a seat in Congress from Georgia and was praised by President Trump as a, quote, future Republican star. Among a great many other wild assertions, the central belief appears to be that the world is run by a cabal of Satan-worshipping pedophiles who are plotting against President Trump while operating a global child sex trafficking ring, and even that they kill and eat their victims. Just yesterday, you wrote an eye-popping article for Yahoo News about what some people characterize as a nationwide strategy launched by the National Republican Congressional Campaign Committee, the official campaign arm of GOP members of the House of Representatives, accusing Democratic candidates as secret supporters of sexual abusers of children. Would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. And I got to say, there aren't a lot of things that shock me these days. I've been around for a while. I've seen a lot. I know how low politics can get at times. But this QAnon phenomenon has really blown me away in terms of the traction it's gotten. You accurately describe the core beliefs of the QAnon cult, and that's sort of what it is, which is that there's this secret cabal of, pedophiles and Satan worshipers who are part of the deep state and are plotting against President Trump. It seems so absurd and preposterous on its face. When I first heard about it, it was hard for me to take it terribly seriously. And this was a couple of years ago when people with Q signs and Q posters would start showing up at Trump rallies. And, surely I concluded, or I thought then, that this was some, way out fringe group, and that in any large political rally, you're going to get, some group of crazies who show up. But it has had far more traction than I ever would have expected. I think largely, and we can get into this gets very much into, why are we in this golden age of conspiracy theories in which they fly around and get, and have people pushing them and believing in them far more than we've had in the past. And that's because of social media, and because of the ease with which people can, connect with like-minded people or people who are receptive to their messaging on the internet, bypassing, standard news media with its sort of traditional standards of what's fit to print. And the story I did the other day really did shock me, because here you had the National Republican Congressional Campaign Committee, which is the campaign arm of House Republicans, running these ads that are just off the charts, attacking various Democratic candidates as protectors of pedophiles and child molesters. And they don't mention QAnon. Of course, the NRCC in these ads, they don't identify, they don't self-identify themselves as backing the bizarre QAnon conspiracies, but what else accounts for why you would be running these ads at this point in time? The one we focused on in the lead was Tom Malinowski, a guy I've known for many years. He was the Washington director of Human Rights Watch back in the day, I think for about 18 years. And I knew him as one of those who was a quite forceful advocate against torture, against human rights abuses around the world. He then served as Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights in Barack Obama's State Department under John Kerry, when John Kerry was Secretary of State, and he was elected to Congress in 2018. And suddenly he's being hit with these NRCC-funded ads that start out in this, with this sort of creepy images of quiet suburban neighborhoods in which they are suggesting, behind every corner in the shadows are child molesters, and Tom Malinowski is protecting these child molesters. The basis for it is that 14 years ago, it goes on to say, and he opposes the National Sex Offender Registry and lobbied against it. And the slender basis for that was 14 years ago, another lobbyist at Human Rights Watch who worked on domestic programs, Malinowski worked on foreign and national security programs, wrote a letter opposing some provisions in the Omnibus Crime Bill of 2006 that was that called for lifetime registry for sex offenders long after they had served their sentences, and up to 20 years for people who were low level or convicted of misdemeanors. And look, this was a civil liberties issue. Other civil liberties groups took the same position, but there was no evidence Malinowski had anything to do with it. He didn't sign off on the letter. He didn't write it. There's no evidence he ever testified on this issue at all. It's not related to anything that's before Congress at the moment. That's one of the striking points about this. So why is the NRCC dredging this up, stretching the facts to hit him at this moment in time with an ad like that, which is running in New York media markets? The NRCC has spent something like $250,000 on it. And, what a lot of people think when you look at other and similar ads they're running around the country is that this is a dog whistle to the QAnon crowd. This is a play for people who actually believe in this, bizarre idea of, secret child molesters who are running the deep state. And clearly that is a sign that this really crazy conspiracy theory is getting traction. And you put it together with, as you mentioned, Marjorie Taylor Greene, the House, who won the House Republican primary in Georgia and is, as I understand it, running without opposition. So she will be a member of Congress. Trump praises her as a future Republican star and then invites her to the White House lawn for his acceptance speech at the RNC. And I don't know if you all saw when Trump was asked about QAnon a few weeks ago, he said, my understanding is these are people who love our country. I don't know much about them, but if they love our country, and I understand they like me. So, that's was a sort of a sign. And one more point I'll make on this is in the Conspiracy Land series, our second season, which we just released a couple of weeks ago, and it's a podcast. You can just download Conspiracy Land and listen to it. And that's the one that delved into that Joe Scarborough matter. The reason we did that is because Trump was tweeting about this all spring. He was accusing one of his media critics, Joe Scarborough, of having murdered a woman who worked for him 19 years ago because, and Trump actually sort of more than implied this, whatever happened to your girlfriend, he wrote in one of his tweets, that they were supposedly having a sexual affair. And there was absolutely nothing to back this up. We interviewed in his first interview the husband of the woman who did die from an undiagnosed heart ailment. It was a horrible freak accident. It was a medical issue. There was no evidence of foul play, no evidence she was murdered. The police, concluded that right from the get-go, and nothing has come forward that has challenged their conclusion. But the fact that Trump would use this, dredge up this conspiracy theory with nothing to back it up, in the spring of 2020, in the middle of the COVID epidemic and an economic recession, there were 10 tweets round the clock that Trump was fanning this. And then, and this is the crucial point, the QAnon people pick up on it. And they quote from Trump's tweet saying, Trump wouldn't be saying this if he didn't know something. There must be something here. And then they run with it and embellish it and turn it into the young woman whose name was Lori Klasutis had access to secret documents showing, white death squads and assassinations by the deep state and, complicity in 9/11 and the Oklahoma City bombing and all sorts of nutty stuff. And it's all inspired by the President of the United States. And we are in a weird moment. There's so much that is weird and strange about where we are right now as a country and this election. But, and so much of this sort of, runs by, it whips everybody up into a frenzy one day, and then there's some other outrage or outrageous tweet or, statement the next day, and people forget about, what happened the day before. So what we tried to do in this podcast is just take one of these things, like the Joe Scarborough matter, and put it under a microscope, tell the story of what really happened, and then show how this has gotten the kind of traction it is and how it moves through social media, boosted by the president, and into the bizarro world of QAnon.
Well, I think you do a real service in shining a spotlight on these issues, on these dark corners. Can you help us calibrate it a little? I mean, what I mean is, just talking about it kind of makes you feel a little hysterical, like why are we giving this so much airtime? And yet I saw, for example, an NBC News report that said there was an internal Facebook study that found there are thousands of QAnon groups with millions of members on the platform.
Yeah, I mean, look, I haven't seen any poll that can quantify, how many people actually believe this stuff. And I'm not sure that a lot of QAnon followers would ever tell a pollster they believe it. And that's one of the problems. But clearly, I mean, the fact that the NRCC is running these ads right now, I think is a pretty good sign that they believe that whether or not somebody self-identifies as QAnon, the issues and the conspiracies that they're putting out there on Facebook, on some of these fringe sites, they've been sort of kicked off a lot of, when I think Facebook and Twitter has both sort of taken down self-identified QAnon accounts, but there are so many other outlets and websites for these people to connect with a large audience that it is pretty alarming. I should add one other point is that, in most cases, these serve a political narrative. The first season of Conspiracy Land, which we did last year, about the Seth Rich case, is a classic example of that. And where Seth Rich was this young DNC staffer who is killed in what in the streets of Washington in the summer of 2016 in what the police, concluded was a botched robbery. He was walking home late at night. Some guys tried to hold him up. He fought back. They shot, and it was a tragic death. But very quickly, the idea got out there that no, this was not an isolated botched robbery. This was a political assassination. Now, who first planted the idea that this was a political assassination, that he was killed, murdered by folks who were who wanted him dead for a political reason? It was an obscure website that, when you trace it back, is an outlet for Russian propaganda. And we had for the first time, the federal prosecutor was in charge of the Seth Rich case. And she immediately was able, not immediately, but over time, was to be able to trace that back to a report circulated by the SVR, the Russian intelligence service, their version of the CIA, which planted this idea. It immediately gets picked up on social media by the allies of Donald Trump. Roger Stone starts tweeting about it, just within a few weeks of Seth Rich's death. Was this another dead body in the Clintons' wake that he was supposedly, Seth Rich had, there are various versions of this, that he was killed by assassins working for Hillary Clinton, that he had leaked the DNC emails to WikiLeaks, and that's why he was murdered. All of this fit the Russians' narrative in trying to deflect from what the Russians did in 2016, and it was Donald Trump's, the allies of Donald Trump. We found Steve Bannon at the White House was fanning the Seth Rich conspiracy. And ultimately, of course, it winds up on Fox News, and Sean Hannity is shouting it to the rooftops. And it was all nonsense. There was nothing that associated Seth Rich with the WikiLeaks and the DNC emails. But that's an example of how, when a conspiracy theory fits a political narrative that's useful for folks, it gets traction like this one did.
Well, and I know you've often pointed out the horrible consequences that this kind of conspiracy story has for the innocent victims.
Right, exactly. In the Seth Rich case, we spoke to the parents who are just anguished that the death of their son becomes fodder for these conspiracy theories that then get broadcast on the country's largest cable news network and fanned from the White House. And similarly, in the case of the Joe Scarborough matter, I spoke, and he's kind of the star of the second season, is the widower of Lori Klausutis, who talked about the inhuman pain and anguish this has meant for him and Lori Klausutis' family, to have her name bandied about there, that she was having an affair with Scarborough and got murdered as a result. I mean, this is very painful for people who get swept up in these conspiracy theories. So that sort of human element is something we've tried to do in the Conspiracy Land podcast, to give people the dimension of, this affects real people.
The current episode on your podcast, Skullduggery, focuses on the two-part miniseries that's going to be aired, I think, Sunday and Monday on Showtime.
Right.
Your guest was the producer and director, Billy Ray, and the first episode focuses on the story of the FBI's investigation into Hillary Clinton's emails. Many analysts conclude that Comey's public pronouncements about the investigation cost Clinton the election. Billy Ray seems to take issue with that. I'm curious what your view is.
Well, Billy Ray was, he's a very talented writer and director of the movie, and lots of films. But he was adopting James Comey's book. The show is called, and it'll be on Showtime this weekend. It's called The Comey Rule, and it is, although nuanced and in many respects very accurate from what I could tell, although it does take some liberties, as these docudramas, almost inevitably do. But it is essentially sympathetic towards Comey, but it does put you in the room inside the FBI as they were grappling with how to handle the Hillary Clinton email matter and all the ways that it would inevitably, that it threatened to hurt the FBI because, you had one big chunk of the country that was quite worked up over Hillary Clinton's emails. If the then Obama Justice Department came out and announced that it was simply not going to prosecute, that would look political, and from Comey's perspective, the FBI would be tainted. Comey took it upon himself to do what he did. He didn't get clearance from his bosses at the Justice Department, and that's one of the justifiable criticisms that people have of Comey. It was not your job to make those decisions on your own. You can justify them, and one can, and he made some plausible arguments, not more than plausible. He made some reasonable arguments for doing what he did, but at the end of the day, he, I think, can reasonably be accused of substituting his own image for that of the FBI. He was worried that he might look bad. He viewed it in his own mind as the FBI was going to look bad, but at the end of the day, there was more than a small element of how's it going to look to me, particularly when he wrote that letter in late October, having told the Congress that the case was closed. He felt he had to come clean, otherwise he would be accused of as he put it, concealing something, which is really a bizarre term for an FBI director to talk about an ongoing FBI investigation. Every FBI investigation is supposed to be secret. You're not concealing something. You're doing your job of, investigating in a non-public way potential crimes. And then if you find one, then you go public. And what impact did it have on the election? I think it did have a really significant impact on the election. It fired up Trump's base. It raised further questions about a matter that Hillary Clinton thought was behind her. I should say, at the risk of losing some of your audience, I do not believe that the Hillary Clinton thing was a trivial matter. I thought that she clearly broke the rules. She clearly did what was best for her, and something that was not conform to the U.S. government rules about how you're supposed to handle emails. I, as a reporter, like to rely on the Freedom of Information Act to get access to government, what the government is doing on its own. And Hillary Clinton set up a system so that her emails were immune from FOIA discovery. People were filing Freedom of Information Act requests in real time while she was Secretary of State and after, and we're getting responses from the State Department saying, we have found no emails that cover this matter. Well, sure they didn't, because Hillary Clinton had her own private email system. That was wrong. She deserved to be called out for that. Whether, I think Comey was right that it didn't rise to the level of a criminal charge, but I do take issue with those people who try to dismiss it as all some, Republican Fox News inspired attack. It was a legitimate issue that for the press to write about.
Well, the second episode of the Comey Rule focuses on Comey's relationship with Trump. We all remember the moment when Trump calls Comey over from across the room at the White House, aggressively shakes his hand and pulls him close, and reportedly whispers to him, I look forward to working with you. Let's take a picture.
Yeah.
It was downhill from there, of course.
Right. Yeah. It's pretty dramatic. I mean, I recommend the series. I mean, I've got qualms and criticisms, you know, as I inevitably would in, you know, for anything on the subject. But I think it pretty well captures just how Comey and the rest of the FBI were trying to process having this president who clearly was not going to conform to any of the institutional norms that we have come to expect. And particularly, you know, ever since Watergate, there's been a pretty bipartisan understanding and acceptance and that the Justice Department and FBI investigations should be immune from political influence from the White House. That in order for us to have faith in the integrity of law enforcement and in particular investigations that touch on the political world, they have to be seen as being done by people who are not acting for political motives and not acting as a result of political pressure. And clearly from the get-go, that was not an institutional norm that Donald Trump was going to accept. He has dinner with James Comey. It's brilliantly recreated in this movie and demands loyalty, says, I want loyalty. Comey, played by Jeff Daniels, is struggling with what do I say to that, you know? And then, of course, Trump asks in a later meeting for Comey to go easy on Mike Flynn, let him go. Again, something totally inappropriate. Comey doesn't know how to handle getting a request like that from the president, and then having Trump call him and demand that Comey go public and say the president is not under investigation. So, you know, those were very troubling events for people inside the FBI. It's what led to the appointment of Robert Mueller. It, you know, in some ways, we've still been living with the consequences ever since.
Well, you wrote the book on what we've come to call the Russian collusion. What's your assessment? How well do they deal with this part of the story?
Well, it doesn't take the story through to the actual Mueller investigation. The sort of one odd narrator in this, who's not a terribly sympathetic person in the movie, is Rod Rosenstein, who oversaw the Mueller investigation, and he doesn't come off very well in the Comey Rule. That's probably not surprising, given that it was Rosenstein who actually wrote the letter that was used to fire Comey. So since this is based on Comey's book, you know, it shouldn't be surprising that Rosenstein doesn't come off well. I mean, look, the story of the Mueller investigation is a tangled one. The prosecutors and Mueller's team came up with a lot of damning evidence, but they ultimately concluded that they did not have enough evidence for a underlying charge of conspiracy, and Trump has been able to point to that ever since. But as you probably read, one of Mueller's prosecutors, Andrew Weissman, has a new book out in, I think, next week, in which he's going to say that people on Mueller's staff, particularly his principal deputy, held the team back from doing a more aggressive investigation. And at the same time, there were clearly mistakes by the FBI. The use of the Steele dossier and the FISA warrant for Carter Page. That's not a trivial thing. This was a political opposition research document that was used by the FBI to get this secret warrant on a guy who was at the time a member of Trump's Foreign Policy Advisory Board, or at least started out in that way. And we now know from the Inspector General report that at a very early on, the FBI had good reason to know that not only was the Steele dossier uncorroborated, but that many of its more sensational allegations were simply not true, or were so thinly sourced that there were gossip and internet rumor more than anything else. And that's something that is we have to deal with. That of course, it was the Steele dossier that put the golden showers and the prostitutes out there, and that is recreated in this in the Comey rule, because Comey, in his first meeting with Donald Trump, presents him with the allegations of the Steele dossier, saying, "We're not saying we believe this, but we want to give you a heads up on that it's out there." And as we do in the introduction to Russian Roulette, we talk about how that can be interpreted how it was interpreted by Trump, and how it can be interpreted by anybody when an FBI director is letting a president know he's got something on you. That was something that J. Edgar Hoover did. Now, James Comey is no J. Edgar Hoover, but when you hold a position like that as the director of the FBI, I think you do have to be pretty careful about how you use uncorroborated allegations like the Steele dossier was.
I think last week, it was, you had Bob Woodward on the podcast, and it struck me he seemed to accept that the conclusion of the Mueller report was that there was no collusion, number one, and number two, that there was no assertion of a violation of law.
Well, I mean, a couple of things to say about that. Yes, and Bob has sort of pretty much held that view, I think, from the beginning. I mean, look, Mueller did not charge a criminal conspiracy. So, right. I mean, you have an extensive investigation. You have to accept the conclusions of that investigation, unless you've got pretty good reason to have a whole nother one. I think, that said, as we document in the book, there were a lot of troubling connections between people in Trump world and the Russians. The FBI was entirely justified in wanting to try to understand what these connections were about. The Russians did engage in an unprecedented attack on our elections in 2016. It wasn't just hacking the emails of the DNC and John Podesta. It was the weaponizing of that material and using it for political effect to influence voters. And then you put on top of that the social media efforts by the Russian trolls masquerading as Americans or American groups and stirring up people. I mean, those were things we had not seen before. They were serious, and the sort of acceptance, the willingness of Trump and his campaign to accept the Russians' help was legitimately disturbing to anybody. And, you put that on top with Trump's efforts to try to do business in Russia, to build a Trump Tower, even while he's running for president, which I think was one of the more stunning revelations of the Trump Mueller investigation.
All of that part of it, we eventually learned, was outside of the scope of the Mueller investigation, right?
Well, no, I mean, Michael Cohen pled guilty to lying to Congress about the efforts for Trump Tower. So that, as it pertained to Michael Cohen, but again, what did they get him on? I mean, you know this, Rich, they got him for lying. I mean, that's what you get people on often. That's what they got, Roger Stone on. That's what they got Michael Flynn on. It's when you lie about it. In Trump's case, I think the critique of Mueller is he didn't push for a subpoena. I think that's one of Weissman's criticisms, that they should have subpoenaed the president and gotten him under oath. Instead, they took these written answers, which are, of course, going to be lawyered so that the president would be bulletproof to a criminal charge. I don't recall. I'm not sure. There's a million ways you could say it, so you can't bring a criminal charge for lying. And there was no follow-up. There was no way for Mueller's prosecutors to then grill the president more closely, confronting him with evidence and emails, with documents, that sort of thing that you would do in a real deposition. So, could they have taken this further? I think, that's the argument Weissman has. I don't think it's as clear as he says, because you got, there are predicates you need. The argument of Mueller was, if we subpoenaed the president, it would end up in a protracted legal battle that would delay the investigation for months and months and wind up before the Supreme Court. And, once Brett Kavanaugh was on the Supreme Court, would you want to bet the ranch that the Supreme Court, even with Ruth Bader Ginsburg still alive, that there'd be a majority to uphold the subpoena against the president? And I think, that's a judgment call that people could reach different conclusions on.
What do you make of the Supreme Court nomination fight?
Well, I have to say, Friday night when I heard the news, I did not think that they would have that they would go through with trying to ram through a nominee in the closing weeks of the election, given what Mitch McConnell and his Republican colleagues said about Merrick Garland. But it's clear they are. It's now clear. We interviewed Sheldon Whitehouse on Skullduggery yesterday, and it was pretty clear he's resigned. They've got no procedural hat tricks that they can use to slow this freight train down. So it's beginning to look like a fait accompli that Trump will get his ninth member of the Supreme Court, and it will be a conservative replacing the liberal Ruth Bader Ginsburg. That will have long-term consequences for the rule of law. Now, we have an election. The Senate is up as well. Right now, it looks entirely possible that not only will Biden win, but that the Democrats have a good chance of getting back control of the Senate. And then I think there's going to be a real debate about expanding the Supreme Court, about doing away with the filibuster, about maybe letting Washington, D.C. become a state, as there's something that's already passed the Democratic-controlled House, which would inevitably add 2 more senators. So I don't know. We're in we're in strange territory right now, and that all that assumes that we'll be able to we'll know the results of the election, and that does seem to be something up in the air as well.
Right. And we won't be waiting for the Supreme Court to tell us the results of the election.
Well, I mean, we could, right? I mean, if there's litigation, if it's not a landslide, there's going to be litigation. I mean, there'll be litigation anyway, left and right. And, think about it. There's, it will depend. I mean, will they be able to get this Supreme Court nominee confirmed before Election Day? Probably. But if they didn't, you'd have an 8-member Supreme Court, which could be divided 4-4. Mm-hmm. Then it would be which appellate court a decision from which appellate court are they reviewing, right? Or what if it's a split in the circuits, right? Which often is when Supreme Court takes decisions. So one circuit rules one way, another court rules another way, and then you have a divided 4-4 court. And also, interesting question, even if they get their nominee through, will that nominee participate in deciding whether the guy who just picked her, Donald Trump, is going to, whether she, apparently it is going to be a she, whether she should participate or not. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people saying, no, she shouldn't. Trump has just picked you. You're too beholden to him. You can't objectively rule on it. It's a lot of interesting questions here.
Yeah, a great many interesting questions, and as you alluded to, if they're not able to meet the deadline of November 3rd, all indications are that they would go ahead and do it in the lame duck, so that you could have a Supreme Court justice confirmed by a number of senators who had just been defeated, and the president who appointed the nominee.
I think that would be the bridge too far, if and would almost certainly guarantee a expansion of the court once the Democrats take through. If the Republicans lose the Senate and lose the presidency and still go ahead and confirm a Trump nominee, I mean, not only will you have, riots in the streets, but I mean, the Democrats will be so justifiably inflamed that I think all those proposals on the table will be impossible to resist. I mean, it's interesting, when I asked White House about expanding the court yesterday on the podcast, he was not yet ready to go there. He would not reporting that.
I was thinking, as you were talking about a bridge too far, that may be what's a bridge too far.
Which, the lame duck or the expanding the court?
The court.
Expanding the court. Well, if it's done by a lame duck Senate, then
I'm not sure Biden wants to go there.
Yeah, but then he would be, under the thumb of a clear conservative majority in the Supreme Court that would be able to thwart almost everything that he wants to do as president. Because, as you know, and as we've seen, everything ends up in the courts nowadays, right? Affordable Care Act, what year was it passed? Like 6-7 years ago? And they've got all arguments on that scheduled for early December. So everything ends up getting challenged before the Supreme Court. And if you have that kind of clear authority, it's going to make it very difficult for him to work his will as president.
What is the longer term impact of expanding the court?
I mean, listen, it's not good. Yeah, I mean, yeah, you're right. Because once Republicans get back control of the Senate and the presidency, they'll do the same thing, right? And it'll be an arms race.
Broad court.
Yeah, yeah. The Supreme Court will start to look like the House of Representatives. Right?
Okay, let me change gears for a moment here. Whenever we have successful figures in the public arena like yourself here, because I know many Brown students interested in national affairs and policy are interested in careers in government, in politics, and in journalism. I like to ask, could you talk a little bit about how you got where you are? What was the route you followed, and what were the decisions you made? And
yeah, it's all ultimately happenstance, right? I mean, one thing leads to another that opens doors. I mean, I'm old enough that when I was in college, Watergate was going on, and I could remember reading. I went to Washington University in St. Louis. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch carried the Washington Post wire service, so I would be reading these articles by Woodward and Bernstein every day and lapping it up, and the whole Nixon drama was unfolding while I was still in college. I remember when the White House tapes came out, we would reenact them with my buddies in school. So I was, got me interested in journalism and being a journalist. And kicking ass, as it were. I had a hard time finding a job in it. It was a tight market at the time. I had done some stringing for the Post-Dispatch, and I'd been an editor at my school paper. I went to journalism school, Medill. They had a Washington program that brought me to Washington, and I began writing for, I started out, they assigned me a paper, the Alton Telegraph, which is a small paper in Illinois across the river from St. Louis. And I was their sort of Washington correspondent. And I ended up convincing them to hire me for $100 a week as their full-time Washington correspondent. And I worked out of the Senate Press Gallery, banging out stories on a typewriter. And anyway, and then I got hired by a couple of small news services, one being States News Service, which covered Washington for small papers, and that eventually got me a job with the Washington Star, which was then the afternoon newspaper in Washington. And it was a pretty damn good newspaper. A lot of great reporters worked for it, were colleagues of mine on the Metro staff, Maureen Dowd, Fred Hyatt, the editorial page editor of the Washington Post, Jane Mayer. I mean, there were a lot of big names that were, now big names. We were all just kids back then, working for the Washington Star. And I'll never remember, then in 1981, the Washington Star folds. It had been bought by Time Magazine. Time Magazine concluded that there was no money in running an afternoon newspaper in Washington. And so, of course, everybody wanted a job at the Washington Post. And I was one of a number of Washington Star reporters who got hired by the then Metro editor of the Washington Post, Bob Woodward. And that's what brought me to the Post. I was at the Post for 14 years. Then I went to Newsweek for 13 years, and then was at NBC. And, here I am today.
Let me ask you this. I mean, we've been in an environment, at least throughout this presidency. I mean, the president repeatedly refers to the media as the enemy of the people. Some of the polling to research that's been done shows a marked slippage in the confidence that the general public has in the media, along with just about every other institution, by the way, except maybe the military. But I'm curious about how this has impacted you personally, or do you feel that it has?
Well, I mean, look, it's pretty nasty out there. I mean, when you do investigative stories that are unflattering to people in high places, you get used to being attacked. And I've been excoriated across the political divide for many years. So I'd like to think I have a thin skin. I do notice when people take shots at me. I mean, you pay attention, but you know, I don't. I usually don't react, and that sort of goes with the territory. Feel confident in what you've done. If your facts are right, if your story holds up, or if you at least did the things you should be doing as a reporter, you're okay. We all get stuff wrong from time to time. It's happened to me. It's happened to everybody I know in this business. But you honestly do try to get it right. You do conform to the standards of our profession, and there are people who have it a lot worse than I do, who are covering wars, who get foreign journalists. I mean, working on a project now related to the Jamal Khashoggi murder. I mean, there's a journalist who was murdered by his government. So that's not something we journalists in America have had to deal with. So yes, the president can call us names, can go after us. In this, I remember the one time I interviewed Donald Trump. This is before he became president. This was on NBC. I did a big piece for NBC Nightly News on Trump when he was thinking about running the first time in 2011, running in 2012. And I was, as the investigative reporter, I was asked to do a piece on his business record. And so long story, finally, did an interview with him at Trump Tower for Nightly News, and, confronted him on all his bankruptcies, and, one by one went through them, and, pushed him really hard, and he didn't like it, and then went on CNBC the next day and called me the worst reporter in America. I got high fives from my colleagues for that. So I think that, at this point, getting called names by Donald Trump is not the worst thing in the world.
Reminiscent of the days when it was a badge of honor to be on the Nixon enemy list.
Yeah, right. Well, Trump's enemies list is so long and vast. It beggars description.
Let's turn to some questions from our audience.
Sure.
What makes people believe this absurd stuff? Is it that for them facts follow their ideology, or is it our educational system failing to teach critical thinking, or both, or something else?
I think it is a combination of a couple things. One is, if you live in the echo chamber of social media and you silo yourself off so that you're only hearing from and talking to people who believe as you do, then you're immune to counterfacts. And when a juicy conspiracy theory can be put forward that seems to explain complicated events in ways that are consistent with your political perspective that you're hearing and communicating with people on social media, and there's no break, there's no outside source of information that you're taking in that could point out, no, that's actually not true. No, that didn't happen. Or, you're forgetting one big thing that completely upends your conspiracy theory. You don't get that. You don't hear that. And then, you put that together with just, and that's not put it together. It's part of it, the polarized world we live in now, political world we live in where, everybody assumes the worst about people on the other side of the fence and assumes that they're, all acting from nefarious motives or corrupt motives. And once you view the world that way, then conspiracy theories, are made to order.
It seems as though a lot of the buffers which used to exist are a lot weaker. For example, the way that these sorts of stories are able to leap across the line from the internet, from social media, into cable news, for example.
Right. I mean, the role of Fox is huge, and its susceptibility to, the craziest of conspiracy theories. I talked before about the Seth Rich case, which, I spent a lot of time on last year, and to see that being broadcast by the biggest stars, promoted by the biggest stars on Fox News is disturbing because there was no break on that. It fit the political narrative of it was red meat for the Fox audience. Now, the more difficult issue for me is how, what do those of us who are not political partisans, but trying to be honest reporters, how do we deal with that? And how do you deal with the Trump presidency? And, look, MSNBC is pretty much, they're going to be, they make no bones about the fact that they are coming from the liberal, progressive, democratic perspective. You know what you're getting. CNN is the one that actually kind of troubles me because they've become the opposition party to Donald Trump. And I understand, why you would do so. Trump says so many preposterous things. He says so many falsehoods. He does so many outrageous things that the temptation is you want to be in their face at every moment, calling him out. And we have a professional obligation to report the news, and when Trump says something that is flatly not true, to tell viewers and readers of that. But how you do it is important. And if it comes off, if you're looking like you're the opposition party, then you're playing into Trump's hands. And you're also undermining the long-term credibility of your news organization. And I think, in my mind, CNN has fallen into that trap, and they now are round the clock, in your face. They're going to call out every one of Trump's lies, and the way they do it, to me, I think is going to have long-term problems for the credibility of CNN, because Trump is going to be gone at some point. And if that becomes the norm of reporting, I think our profession is going to suffer from it.
How useful would it be to analyze the numbers of QAnon bots to somehow estimate the numbers of real QAnon supporters?
I don't know that there's any way to do that because, as we learned from the Russian trolls, bots can be created, multiple bots that can be created. I was stunned. I think I put this in the story the other day that one of these, fringe websites had something like 10 million visitors in the month of July. Does that mean there's 10 million QAnon supporters out there? I don't know that it means that. First of all, some of them could be, almost certainly are returns, like people going every day or every 15 minutes, so how much does that count? Some of them are people around the world. I don't discount that. We haven't talked about this, but we probably should, that, the Russians, the Chinese, other foreign actors could be, fueling some of this, because it perfectly, in the case of the Russians, perfectly serves their purpose in sowing discord among the American electorate. So I just don't know that there are any good ways to quantify the QAnon, the number of QAnon supporters, but the fact that they have gotten the traction they have, and the fact that, the NRCC is running these ads, is a pretty good indicator that if it's not, whether they're appealing to QAnon devotees or just people who are influenced by the kinds of issues that QAnon is raising, suggests that, we're talking about a not trivial number.
Can you comment on whether the Steele document is an early reflection of Trump's fierce rejection of any criticism of Putin or Putin's activities?
Well, I'm not sure I understand that, or whether the Steele dossier it relates to that. Look, the Steele dossier, in broad strokes, did have it right. There was, a Russian attack on the election. There were contacts and friendly contacts between people in Trump world and the Russians. What it had wrong were its particulars about what those contacts consisted of. But the basic point is, and Russian roulette, we deal with this extensively, is Trump has had for many years, even before he became president, this curious affection for Vladimir Putin. And I think it's explainable in a number of ways. First and foremost, he's always wanted to do business there, as he's wanted to do business around the world. And in his mind, the way you do business in a country like that is you go to the top guy, you cultivate the top guy. And that's what he was doing when he tried to meet with Putin during the Miss Universe pageant in 2013. That was the appeal of having the Miss Universe pageant in Moscow back then. It was a way to get him, a way he could use it as leverage to build a Trump Tower in Moscow. And that's why he was saying all these nice things and tried desperately to meet with Putin and flattered him. And then on other levels, Obama put sanctions on Putin after the intervention in Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea. Trump was going to undo everything Obama did. So, check that one. Oh, Obama doesn't like the guy, he's my kind of guy. Thirdly, Putin runs Russia the way Trump wants to run the United States, right? He's an autocrat. He does what he wants. He's not checked by, any opposition party. If he is, Putin will poison them. We don't know that Trump has done that, but he wants, and so he admires Putin, and like he admires and has had friendly relations with Erdogan in Turkey, or Kim in North Korea. I mean, these are all dictators, or MBS in Saudi Arabia, autocratic dictators who run their country without any checks, and that's the way Trump would like to be running the United States. So I think if you put those together, I think that seems to me a plausible explanation for how Trump has dealt with Putin. Could there be other factors like financial leverage, like the prostitutes and the golden shower? Sure, but we have not seen the proof that could substantiate that. So I'll go with the explanations we put out there in Russian Roulette.
Although even given that package of explanations, his relationship with Putin, his affection for him seems incredibly resilient.
It absolutely does. And, the moment, and I got to say, the moment in Helsinki when he basically sided with Putin over the conclusions of the U.S. intelligence community and the law enforcement community was so bizarre and troubling that it almost defies an explanation. But I think at the end of the day, you got to go with what the facts are, with what you can prove and substantiate. We can all have suspicions. I had this exchange with Woodward, right, in the podcast. Do I have suspicions? Sure, there are suspicions, but we got to stick with what we know, and I think there's plenty that we know that can explain most of Trump's conduct.
Okay. Given what has been reported about Facebook, YouTube algorithms, and how quickly conspiracies have spread to younger people on TikTok, what would you consider these corporations' responsibilities are regarding conspiracy and disinformation on their platforms?
I think that they've got a lot of work to do. In the Conspiracy Land series, the last episode is about Twitter and how Twitter has handled this. And, the story here is that the guy we interviewed, TJ Klausutis, that widower of the woman who worked for Joe Scarborough, wrote this incredibly poignant letter, powerful, poignant letter to Jack Dorsey, the CEO of Twitter, last spring in May, pleading with him to take down Trump's tweets about his dead wife. It got Kara Swisher got a hold of it. She's a very influential journalist in Silicon Valley, a former colleague of mine at the Washington Post. She wrote a column about it in the New York Times, and it really helped generate a lot of pressure on not just Twitter, but Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram, all these sites to take a step back and look more closely at what was going on the platform. And there had been, this has been building for some time, right? And, the issue of false information, fake news, as it were, being spread on their platforms was something the companies were grappling with. They didn't really want to deal with it because, as we point out, this is what gets them clicks. This is what gets them audience. You get people angry, you get people inflamed. That's how Facebook connects, and that's how it sells ads, because gets more eyeballs, it sells more ads. Same with Twitter. You inflame people, you get more. So it's interesting. They wouldn't take down, Twitter wouldn't, Dorsey would not take down the tweets about Lori Klausutis, despite that letter from TJ. But starting the day after that letter became public, you started to see Twitter, Facebook, and all of them starting to get much more aggressive in putting up, in taking down or hiding some tweets by Trump, by relating to election security or COVID, when he was saying things that were just flatly untrue about COVID. They could link that to public policy. So what they would do is they would leave it up, but they would say, here's more context, and they would take you to, more reliable sources of information than our president. So you could read that. They've started to do that. But one thing we discovered is Twitter, and I didn't know this, they've got rules of terms of service, so that if you're harassing people online or you're demeaning people online, you could get removed from Twitter. But there was a sort of secret proviso that didn't apply to global leaders, right? It didn't apply to Donald Trump. The terms of service, because the Twitter's policy was that global leaders should be able to tweet whatever they want, and people can respond to that, and that would contribute to a democratic dialogue, right? There's a back and forth between our leader, El Presidente, and the public, right? And that's promoting free speech. That's promoting a democratic dialogue. And probably one of the more powerful moments in Conspiracy Land in that third episode is when I play a response from Dorsey saying that, because this came up at the Twitter shareholder meeting just a week or two later after TJ's letter. This was just this past spring. And I played Jack Dorsey giving that explanation for why they wouldn't take down Trump's clearly false tweets about the death of Lori Klasutis, and played it for TJ. And he says, what bullshit, excuse me. How did what does this have to do with a democratic dialogue about how our country is run? How is letting somebody, say false and sleazy things about the death of my wife? How are you adding to social value by allowing a debate, a democratic debate about whether my wife had an affair with Joe Scarborough and was murdered as a result? I mean, and yeah, I think he had a pretty strong point where there are limits to what you should be allowed to say on Twitter, even if you're the president of the United States.
Although an interesting other side of the coin is that we've come to accept Donald Trump's edicts on Twitter as official pronouncements.
But that's how he communicates, right, with the country. And by the way, look at when he does. It's like, bizarre, middle of the night. Some of these tweets are like 12:30, 1 o'clock in the morning, 5:30 in the morning. I mean, this is the sort of life the guy leads.
In an odd sort of way, it's made him probably the most public and transparent president in that sense in our history.
Well, that is true. We can give him that. He is transparent about what's going through his mind at all hours of the day and night.
Okay. This actually may serve as a good final question. And this questioner asks, all BS flattery aside, thank you for your unusual diligence trying to get to the bottom of things, and, best as I can tell, your nonpartisan conclusions. What is the story that you have worked on that you think should have gotten more attention than it ever did?
Well, how long you got? One of the things you learn when you've been in the business as long as I have is you never really know how a story is going to play and how much attention it's going to get, how much traction it will get. You know, I worked on stories that I thought would be blockbusters and popped them and nobody paid attention, right? Or little attention was paid. And others that I didn't think were all that big a deal, and they took off in ways that I never imagined. I mean, in my first book, Uncovering Clinton, I have a scene where, you know, I had learned about Clinton's relationship with Monica Lewinsky, and then I learned that the then independent counsel, Ken Starr, was investigating that as part of his, as he saw it, his mandate to investigate wrongdoing by the Clintons. There was enormous debate within Newsweek about whether we had enough to go with the story. In my view, we absolutely did, and I think events later proved that out, but editors were nervous. It involved a sexual or allegations of a sexual relationship by the president and and a young former intern White House staffer. And you know, we had pretty good reason to believe that there was something there, but you know, did we have photographs at that point? You know, all sorts of, you always go through this. But to me, the story was simply that, you know, what made it a story was the criminal investigation that Ken Starr had launched using the FBI. And in the course of those, you know, endless hours of debate with the editors at Newsweek on a Saturday afternoon, the then president of Newsweek, the publisher, Richard Smith, said at one point, you know, can we really go with a story that could lead to the impeachment of a president, you know, without, you know, doing X, Y, and Z? And I, as I recount in the book, I looked at my colleague, Dan Kleinman, who was in the room. We looked at each other and rolled our eyes and said, impeachment? You know, who's talking about impeachment here? It's just a good story, right? And an important story. And I think that's a sort of good reflection of how you never can tell how these things are going to play out. You know, look, there's a lot I've done that I thought, you know, I did a lot of reporting back in the day at the Post about the drug war and how that was, and mandatory minimum sentences. That was something I was writing about extensively in the 1980s and 90s. It's, you know, 20 years later, people started to pay attention and doing something about it. But, you know, there were big stories I did that sort of showed just, you know, how unjust these mandatory minimum sentences were at the time. But, you know, that was not what people wanted to hear at the time. It was an era when people wanted to be tough on crime, wanted to be, you know, throw the book at everybody using drugs. One interesting, you know, probably my biggest story when I was covering the drug war was when, you know, there was this famous speech, George H.W. Bush held up a bag of crack in his first nationwide speech as president, saying this bag of crack was sold across the street from the White House. And that shows how, you know, how this is everywhere, and it's, you know, we got to do something about it. And, you know, I was able to document that actually the whole thing was a setup. The speechwriters wrote that in the speech and then had the DEA go lure some kid from Northeast Washington to Lafayette Park so they could make the sale there so the president could hold up the bag of crack. And by the way, that kid ended up getting a 10-year mandatory minimum sentence in federal prison, a kid who had never, it was a first-time offender, no violence. He was a teenager, and he ends up getting thrown in jail in federal prison for 10 years. But the point I was actually going to make was more about the time was, guess who gave the Democratic response to Bush's speech that night? It was Joe Biden. Mm-hmm. And what was his critique of Bush's speech? Bush wasn't tough enough. America is under attack, he said. This is like Pearl Harbor. This is in the days before 9/11, so people even can compare it to 9/11. Anyway, and Biden was attacking Bush from the right for not being tough enough on drugs, and I only make that point to say that was the spirit of the time. That was the thinking of the time, and that's why when you write something that doesn't conform to people's prejudices, that doesn't conform to what the mainstream political narrative is at the time, your stories probably aren't going to get the kind of attention that you'd like them to get.
Yeah, and it seems as though we're in an era now of spectacular stories coming at an incredible rate. The old expression of trying to drink out of a fire hose.
Yes.
And you mentioned it before. Therefore, finding it hard for any particular story to stick and really get traction. I mean, how many times in the last 4 years has there been a story broken where you said, okay, this time, this is the one that's just really gonna, this
almost every week there's been a story that is of that nature, and then you could barely keep track of them
right
the next week.
And yet, in terms of approval ratings, this is probably the most stable presidency that we've seen since we've been doing polling.
We will see in another 6 weeks or so. Right? I mean,
exactly.
I don't know. We will see. I don't want to make a political forecast here because.
Oh, great. I want to thank you so much for joining us tonight. This has been great. And, unfortunately on Zoom, doing all this virtual, we can't hear the applause of the audience, but I'm sure it's a standing ovation.
Okay. Well, thank you. It was an honor to be here through Zoom, and enjoyed it a lot. And,